Welcome everyone, my name is Siobhan Gibbs and this is the first workshop in our series, Working Well with Women with Disabilities, Workshop 1, Foundational Knowledge. So this workshop series was developed with WILD in partnership with Work Up Queensland and Queenslanders with Disability Network. Women with Disability were involved in all aspects of development of this workshop series, such as the facilitation of live workshops as well as the recording of these videos. Throughout this series, we'll use the term disability, which we are inclusive of people that experience chronic health conditions. So it's an umbrella term that we're using to include all of those people that identify as having a disability. I want to thank all the women involved for sharing their experiences and their wisdom and making this series what it is. So before we get started, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that we live and work on stolen land. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We want to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who've contributed to this project, as well as their ongoing wisdom sharing and support for our sector. This was and always will be Aboriginal lands. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge all the people with disability that have contributed to this project and continue to support our sectors. Their wisdom is invaluable and they are paving the way for more inclusive and accessible communities and services. It's important to take a moment now before we get started that we are going to be discussing gendered violence, abuse and neglect. Some of these themes might be triggering or difficult, so please do what you need to do to take care of yourself. If that means pausing the video, taking a break, feel free to go through this training series at your own pace. It's also okay to be challenged. This is a new field for many people, as well as there's a lot within this that recommends start shifting our style of working. And of course, if you need additional support, 1-800-RESPECT is an awesome point of call for that. So as I said, today is the first in our workshop series. So there's 5 different workshops we'll be covering across this. And today we're starting with foundational knowledge. This series was developed more specifically for those working in sexual assault, domestic and family violence and women's health and wellbeing services within Queensland. So though much of the information will be relevant nationally, there will be some elements that are Queensland specific. So I just want to flag that before we get started. So a little bit about what we're going to be covering today. So we're going to be looking at what is disability. We're going to be talking about language when we're describing and discussing disability, how to identify disability. We're going to talk a little bit about decision makers, support workers and disability supports, but we'll be looking at that more so in workshop 4. And then we'll also start talking about tips for good practice. However, that will be something we develop upon across the next few workshops. If there is anything that comes up from these workshops that you're curious to learn more, I highly recommend you look at the Work Up website and the WILD website, as well as the QDM website. There's a plethora of resources. There's also a handout that you will receive as a part of this training series, and within that has access to a whole lot more information. So to get started, 4.4 million people in Australia identify as living with a disability, and that statistic was in 2019. And it's important to acknowledge too that that statistic also includes people who live with chronic health conditions. So roughly 1 in 5 people live with a disability, and often disability is underreported. So it is highly likely that you are currently working with women with disabilities in your practice right now. We're going to start looking at disability in terms of definitions and how we describe or define disability. We'll be providing a full list of different types of definitions in the handout, but we'll be looking at a couple more specifically now. So when we often describe disability, we talk about it in a really generalist or medical view. So when we have a form, when someone is new coming to our service, we often need to tick in a box whether or not they identify as having a disability. And that's what we describe as a medical definition of disability, which I'll break down a bit more for you now. So disability is a broad spectrum. So though it might be a tick box whether or not someone has a disability, it's important to acknowledge that within that, it is a huge umbrella that covers a whole lot of different stuff. So you can see here the National Disability Service breaks down disability into these categories. And that ranges from intellectual disabilities, acquired brain injuries, neurological disabilities through to physical disabilities, as well as our sensory disabilities such as deafblind, vision, hearing, speech, as well as psychiatric disabilities and developmental delays. It's important to acknowledge too that not everyone's experience of disability will fall into these clear categories. And as we'll talk about more throughout this series, it's always important to take lead from the person with disability, how they wish it to be described. So we're looking at first the medical model of disability. So this is often how our legislation or how our funding bodies define disability or who is eligible for disability supports. So this is that the medical model of disability perceives a person's disability creates the barriers for them to access society. So it is on the individual. It creates a narrative in communities that a person with disability is the problem, which of course is not correct. Our communities are often inaccessible and don't accommodate people with disabilities, which is at no fault of the person. Sometimes people feel frustrated or overwhelmed by the thought of working with someone with disability. So this series is to encourage us all to shift that lens and to work better with them. What we prefer to look at disability as is through the social model of disability. And this is now enshrined in international law. The United Nations acknowledge this as being the best way to perceive and understand and define disability. And this is broadly accepted through the disabled community, and it reframes the medical model and points to society and structures as being the problem, not the individual. So it talks about the fact that organizations are often inflexible in their procedures and practices. We have inaccessible environments, how often we work in workplaces that have a step up to get into the workplace. We might have a wheelchair accessible counseling room, but not necessarily a wheelchair accessible bathroom. And also community attitudes. So discrimination, stereotyping, and prejudice. Someone is too hard to work for, or that we often feel resistant to working with someone with disability because we think it will be more work for us as a worker. It's really important to be aware of when we jump to these assumptions, when we have these embedded biases within ourselves as workers, and that we really can work to unpick this. So switching our lens from looking at the individual as the problem to looking outward into our communities and perceiving where the barriers exist for those individuals. So I want you to take a moment now. If you like, you can pause the video and have a quick reflection about what model is predominantly used in your workplace, either the medical model of disability or the social model of disability. And how do you think that affects your practice with women with disabilities? Often in our workplaces, we have to understand both models because often the medical model is how we report or make notes around how we work with a person with disability. But is that actually the most useful way for us to perceive a person? So just take a moment now, potentially reflect with your colleagues, and then come back to the video. So the Centre for Research Excellence in Disability and Health from the Uni of Melbourne last year created a survey where they had a quick look at community beliefs and attitudes around disability. So it's interesting taking a look at this as a really quick snapshot of the attitudes that exist within our community. So you can see here that 63% of people agreed that people with disability are easier to take advantage of, exploit, or treat badly. And it's important to acknowledge when we start to look at these sort of deficit stereotypes that we can hold an understanding in our minds that we know that people with disabilities, particularly women with disabilities, are overrepresented in statistics around sexual violence and domestic and family violence, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're at fault. And it's really important when we use words like exploitability and vulnerability, we acknowledge that that comes with a perception that coming back to the medical model, that it is at the fault of the person with disability, which we know is not the truth. It's also the hero narrative, that 63% of people agreed that people with disability were inspiring. And this was an interesting note when we were having our focus groups around developing these workshops. And we discussed how this can sometimes be not such a useful attitude that comes in communities. Some of the women I spoke with would describe that in workplaces or situations, they were often heralded as these heroes, because they would push beyond their capacity of their disability or beyond fatigue to complete their work, which in fact creates this really difficult culture for people with disabilities, that they feel they need to exert themselves and often make themselves feel unwell or uncomfortable because they feel they need to push beyond their limits or capacity of that day to meet the expectations of what society thinks is a normal level of output or workload. And we need to remember too that as able-bodied people, our perception of how long an appointment can go for, how early a day should start, doesn't necessarily apply to everybody. And it's really important that we acknowledge that we shouldn't be putting someone in an uncomfortable position where they could injure themselves or make themselves sick in order to access support. Attitudes about personal lives. 6% of people agreed that sex should not be discussed with people with disability. So this is a really small portion of people that responded, but it still is a group of people. And particularly working at WILD, where we specifically work with people with intellectual and cognitive disabilities who experience violence, a lot of them talk about the fact that they've never had a sex education, and that has made them navigating sexual relationships really difficult, and has also made it really difficult for them to identify when there is abuse and violence happening. So it's a really important thing to acknowledge that when we are having discussions with people seeking support who have disabilities, particularly for sexual violence and domestic and family violence, that we don't shy away from anything or make the assumption that they can't handle it or they don't want to discuss it, because we need to discuss all of these things clearly as we would any other client. So it's really important those attitudes don't filter in. 16% of people also agreed with this statement, that people believed that people with disabilities should not raise children. So that's like almost 1/5 of respondents to this survey, which is also really concerning. We currently live in a society where we see legislation that determines whether or not someone has the right to parent their children. And often it can be quite frightening seeing children being removed from their households. So it's really important as workers, particularly when someone's escaping violence or currently in a violent home or relationship, that we also factor in these community attitudes when working with other sectors such as police or child protection or other workers, that these attitudes can actually diminish the way they perceive someone's capacity and not actually perceiving the individual and their capacity to be a really excellent parent. And sometimes that just means they need a bit of additional support, which is all possible. And we'll talk more about that throughout the series. So behaviours towards people with disability. This is probably one of the key ones I want to pull out of all of these statistics that have come back from this survey, which is that 78% of people agreed that they're unsure about how to act towards people with disability. As humans, we often feel uncomfortable or fear what we don't know. And for some people, that is because they haven't had a relationship or worked with a person with disability. So often will find themselves maybe feeling overwhelmed at knowing how to communicate, worrying that they'll say the wrong thing. But having all of those assumptions and biases operating in the back of our minds means that it often creates a barrier in our communication. And we're going to break down communication tips and styles throughout this workshop series that'll be helpful. But most of all, it's just really important to remember that you're talking to a person, and always opening up the dialogue at the very beginning, that if there's anything you don't understand or anything I say that makes you feel uncomfortable, then just let me know. And having a really open dialogue with the person so that you don't find yourself holding back from communication, because often we have to talk about really difficult, complex things when working in the violence sector. When we discussed this at our focus groups, some comments that some of the women made were very interesting. And it was interesting hearing about where people have been in conversations and halfway through a conversation, they've paused and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize you had a disability. It's all right," and getting really uncomfortable at the point of them realizing that the person had an impairment. And it was interesting talking to the women that gave us some feedback around the development of these workshops, that they said that often the moment that someone realizes is just a further reminder of how discriminated against they feel and how excluded they feel in society. And it's also okay to acknowledge that a person has a disability. It doesn't have to be an elephant in the room. It's okay to acknowledge it from the very beginning and not to feel uncomfortable around that. But this is all stuff that will happen from practice. And it's important to always remember that you're never making a person with disability feel uncomfortable for their own lived experience. This is on us as workers to learn how best to work with them. As we sort of delve into the disability space, it's important to flag that, as I mentioned at the beginning, disability covers a broad umbrella of experiences and people and identities. And some people also might not want to use the term disability, but it's really important that we don't homogenize. So that means that sometimes we can make an assumption that one person who identifies as having a disability will have the same needs as another. But as we know, that's just not the case. Even if someone has the same disability, for example, an intellectual disability, that too doesn't mean they have the same experience, as there is a plethora of different experiences of that disability within the term. So when considering to work with people with disabilities, it's really important that we take a moment to connect with the individual and acknowledge what their needs are and what their experience is. We can talk about disability as often being invisible or visible. So for someone with a physical impairment, it's a clear indication of disability. But for people with a psychiatric or intellectual disability, we often refer to those as invisible disabilities, as often there's no clear physical indicator of that disability without having a conversation with that person. It's also important to remember that chronic illness and chronic health conditions are inclusive when we talk about disability, and have until recently been really excluded from the disability space, and still do to this day. The NDIS and other peak bodies don't necessarily acknowledge chronic health conditions as being a disability by their definitions, but it's really clear as further evidence and further research comes out that a person with a chronic health condition has a really similar experience to that of a person with disability. It's also important to acknowledge that different genders experience disability differently, particularly those who identify as female or a woman. They often are worse off in our education, employment sectors and accessing disability funding and services. So there's also a gendered lens that comes to this. And as we explore more around queer identities and transgender people that also have a disability, they too are further discriminated against. So it's important to acknowledge as well that a disability isn't the only part of someone's identity, and all those other facets also impact how they experience their disability in the world. So before we continue, I just want to take a moment to pause and break down particularly how we define intellectual disability. So a lot of other physical disabilities, we have a really clear way of a diagnosis or something that occurs, usually a hospitalization, that then results in a diagnosis and then therefore identity of disability. While some other disabilities are a bit more nuanced, such as intellectual disability, which at Wild is sort of where we specialize in understanding. So for someone with an intellectual disability, they need to have limitations in both their intellectual functioning and their adaptive behaviors. And this originates usually before the age of 22. This is a recent shift in the definition. It used to be before the age of 18, but we now acknowledge that it's before the age of 22. So we define intellectual disability through intellectual functioning. So that's often defined through something such as an IQ test. And generally, there's a test score of around 70 or as high as 75, where it indicates a limitation in intellectual functioning. And then from there and downwards is intellectual impairment. And then we look at adaptive functioning, which breaks down conceptual skills, social skills, and practical skills. So that is conceptual skills such as language, literacy, money, understanding time. Then we look at our social skills. So that's interpersonal skills, social responsibility, self-esteem, naivety, social problem solving. And then we also look at practical skills. So that's daily living, such as personal care, occupational skills, healthcare, etc. So it's important to acknowledge that not everyone will experience a limitation in all of these domains. However, there needs to be some limitation in both adaptive and intellectual functioning in order for it to be classified as intellectual disability. Taking a moment now to specifically have a quick look at chronic health conditions. 47% of Australians have one or more chronic conditions. So that's almost half the population experience chronic health conditions. And it's quite likely as a worker that a few of us have chronic health conditions ourselves. Over the last decade, chronic health conditions have definitely increased in their prevalence. Females aged 15 years and over are more likely than males to experience chronic health conditions, and you also increase in prevalence chronic health conditions as you get older. So these chronic health conditions are often not recognised by NDIS, which is our National Disability Insurance Scheme, and that's where most people access their disability support from. So that means people with chronic health conditions are often restricted in how they access formal support services. And often it usually means that a person doesn't disclose they have a chronic health condition when accessing support because they've experienced so much discrimination and so many barriers up until this point. So many people living with chronic health conditions will rely on formal supports. So that's carers and partners, family members and neighbours, but also those people are often the perpetrators of violence. So we're going to start now with a bit of a case study. So taking a moment now, I'm going to read this out loud and then once again pausing the video to have a reflect, and then we'll continue onwards. So you are a worker at a crisis domestic violence service and you receive a call from a woman named Shelley, and she says that she needs some help. Shelley says that she's feeling frightened at home. She says that she is stuck in bed because her boyfriend has left for the day. Shelley says she would rather meet you in person and that her boyfriend can give her a lift to your service. So you suspect Shelley has a disability. How do you think you would ask that question? And what language would you use to share with Shelley your concerns right now about her safety and well-being? So just take a moment now to pause, potentially have a conversation with a colleague or someone else you're doing this training series with, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion. When we're talking to someone about their disability, in that case study with Shelley, it's really clear that there's things going on for her. The fact that she is bedbound without support, and the fact that she needs someone to give her transport support in order to get anywhere. And that gives us the indication as a worker that there's possibly a disability at play for Shelley. So how do we ask these questions? It can be a difficult and uncomfortable conversation to ask out of the blue. These tips were given to us by women with disabilities about what they feel is the better way to go about this conversation. So it's really important at the beginning to explain why you need to know why that person has a disability. So is it because you need it for your funding? Is it because it helps you provide better support to that person? Is it because your building is inaccessible, so you need to know beforehand so you can make sure the ramp is available to them, etc. And it's really important to reinforce that this isn't because you want to change the way that you work with that person. It's not because you're going to not give them support by them telling you they have a disability. It's important to remind them that this is actually so you can provide the best support possible. So disclosing disability. So in this case example, it was really clear when Shelley was describing her experience about being stuck in bed, needing support for transport. As a worker, we can start to make some assumptions that Shelley may have a disability. So now how do we have a discussion around that? This was a really crucial point of discussion when we were doing our focus groups for this workshop series, because often this can be a really stigmatized and difficult, uncomfortable conversation for people with disabilities. So at the very beginning, when you're asking someone to disclose their disability, you need to make it really clear why. And it's really important to reinforce the fact that you're not going to discriminate or limit access to your service, to that person by knowing they have a disability, you need to in fact talk about the strengths of having that disclosure, because then you can make sure the building is accessible, you can make sure your language is accessible, and you can also just understand the person and their needs a bit better, particularly in domestic and family violence. If someone needs to leave a violent situation, you need to know what support needs need to be in place at the refuge or at the emergency accommodation. In saying that, it is really important to then ensure that your service is accessible to the person requesting support that has a disability. So when we are saying, please share with me your support needs, I need to then be able to guarantee that I can then meet those needs. And if I can't, it's on me as the worker and us as the service to find innovative ways so that we can be accessible and provide that support. So it's important to use a gentle approach. Some of the women I spoke to said that sometimes the question can be asked very bluntly, insensitively, and for a lot of them, do you have a disability? Are you disabled? Has often come with a lot of stigma from school and from family. So it's really important to make it a gentler question. For example, starting off by saying, do you mind me asking this, do you have a disability? Or I'm just going to ask you a few questions about yourself so I can understand you better, just so we can work better together. Let me know if anything I say makes you feel uncomfortable or you want me to stop, for example. It's really important to use the language the person chooses to describe their disability. So some people are comfortable saying that they are a person with disability. Some people prefer being labeled as a disabled person. There's a lot of different discussions in the disability community at the moment around what language to use. And it's really important not to shy away from the language that the person themselves requests of you to use to describe themselves. Just as you would ask someone to pronounce your name properly, it's important to use the language that that person self-identifies. And also talking about why you're recording this information. And this was a point that one of my co-facilitators, Karen, raised, was why are we recording this information about the disability? And talking about how we can use this information to report back to our funding bodies to have a better picture in our minds of the disability community and how they access our services and the prevalence of their experience within the disability community of sexual violence, domestic and family violence, and women's health and well-being. And also talking to your manager and your workplace around where you store that information, because as I said earlier, disability is really underreported. So anything we can do to better that and then better our collective understanding of how we can support people with disability is a great asset to our services. So like I said, when we discuss disability, it's really important to use the language that that person chooses to use. So like I said, it could be that someone says, I have a disability, I'm a person with disability, I'm a disabled person, I have a chronic health condition, or I live with a chronic health condition. So you can see how there's slight nuance in how we describe it. But it's really important that we are not using deficit terms. So you wouldn't say that someone's afflicted by, crippled by their disability or chronic health condition. A term that is just definitely outdated and discriminatory is saying handicapped or handicapable, specifically abled, special needs. These terms are really outdated and we've probably used them in our sector. You've probably heard them before. I know myself working across different industries, they still occur that people use these terms, but they're definitely outdated and they're definitely discriminatory. So it's really important to be aware of that. So this is, there's actually a list from People with Disabilities Australia, that there's a link in your handout that breaks down these different terms that we should avoid and that we should use instead. So have a look at those if you want to understand that a bit better. So we've had a bit of a discussion around disability, how we define it and how we discuss it. So now it's important to sort of talk about what sits within the broader disability world, which is often services. So a person with disability, depending on their experience, often has a lot of different people and different services involved in their lives. And we can sort of break these down into 4 categories, I guess. So we talk about the NDIS, but that also, like I said, isn't necessarily applicable for every person with disability, particularly if someone has a chronic health condition. The NDIS probably is not something that's in their lives, but they probably have some sort of disability support. So that's looking at things like aids and equipment. The NDIS provides some people with a support coordinator, which sort of functions as a NDIS-specific case manager, support workers, and support accommodation. But we'll break this down a lot more in workshop 4 when we talk about resources. We've also got medical and health professionals. Anyone with a disability or chronic health condition probably has a lot of involvement with their GP and probably have a lot of allied health support. We also look at income, which comes in many forms, and that can be Centrelink, it can be through a job agency, or it can be through employment that could be supported or not. And then also support networks. So there's often a lot of informal supports, such as family, a carer, neighbours, peers and friends, that often provide the bulk amount of support to a person with disability. And it's really important as a worker that we quickly get a snapshot of all these different services that are involved in a person's life, so we can figure out who we can look to work collaboratively with when supporting someone. It's important, I guess, to have a quick moment to consider the fact that we are living in a world where disability and those women with disabilities that experience sexual violence and domestic and family violence are getting a greater platform. We have things like the Disability Royal Commission that is currently underway. And as a result of that, we are hearing a lot more stories from people with disabilities, which is really, really important for our community and for our sector. So you can see here, women with disability can face extra hurdles breaking free of abusers. In this experience, this woman talks about the fact that she was reliant on her abuser or perpetrator of violence for all of her support needs. And often people with disabilities rely on their carer or their partner because often they haven't accessed any mainstream supports before. And it means that often the violence is a lot more nuanced, and it means the choice of leaving and finding new place, safe place to live is a much more complex and difficult decision for a woman with disability to make than those that don't have an experience of disability. So I think it's really important here that we ensure as workers we are listening to the experiences of women with disabilities and keeping an eye on news and information that's coming out more and more so we can understand from the lived experience. We're going to watch a discussion that I had with one of our co-facilitators, Karen, who very generously co-facilitated and co-devised these workshops with me. Karen has a lot of wisdom and insight as both a woman with disability, but also someone that's worked in the disability sector and has also worked in the family sector. And this is a really rich and interesting discussion, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Karen.
I'm excited to be joined here with Karen, my co-facilitator for this workshop. And maybe to get started, Karen, one question that a lot of workers have to ask, but they don't know how to ask it, is asking someone about whether they have a disability and the details of their disability. So what do you think that workers should do when they're asking those questions? What are important parts?
Sure. So I guess my advice would be to wait until the woman identifies as having a disability or that you have enough markers. You know, she might say, oh, I can't do that alone, or I need assistance to do that. So wait until you've got enough clues that there might be one present. And then I always suggest the open and honest approach and just asking, like, do you identify as having a disability? Are you okay if we speak about what that means for you? And I would talk about it in very sort of functional ways. So, for example, can you tell me about how that impacts your everyday life? If someone says, for example, oh yeah, I'm a wheelchair user, so just get some clues about, so does that mean you need, just clarifying, does that mean you need accessible facilities, or Are you able to walk as well? Or, those sort of questions where you kind of are trying to find out more information. Or you might want to, if someone says, I need a little bit of a hand reading, you might say, does that mean you need things in alternative formats? Or, and then going back to the physical disability example, you might say, do you need support with everyday things like personal care and daily living tasks? And generally speaking, when someone identifies as having a disability and it's for something like this where they may need to discuss accommodation options or something, they're more than willing to be forthcoming. There's obvious things that you possibly shouldn't do, and one of those is just assuming things. So always checking back with the woman, always making sure that she's comfortable with your understanding, and always checking in about your understanding. I think that's the way to go. You probably need to check that, around the woman about how she's comfortable identifying with disability. Some people like to put the person first and say person with disability, whereas other people like to just say I'm disabled. And there's really no right or wrong as long as that's coming from the person. And the one thing you should never do is correct how a person identifies themselves. So, for example, if you've been trained that it's always person first and the woman identifies as a disabled woman, you would never correct her because that's how she chooses to be identified and that's her choice.
Yeah, we get really caught up with the language as workers.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of
and everyone's trying to do the right thing, so that's totally understandable.
Yeah. A lot of services will have just on their intake form, does the person have a disability, yes or no? So would you say that direct question probably isn't appropriate? It's better to ask.
Personally, I would wait for markers, but if you felt you had to ask it, I guess you could almost sound apologetic and say, oh, look, it's just a question on the form. But I think once the conversation flows, it might become obvious. And then you can ask more clarifying questions. And it's not, for me, to be an accessible, inclusive service, it's not just about ticking a form on a box that says the caller has a disability or the person has a disability, to be about finding out, well, what does that mean? So you can then ensure your service is more accessible and inclusive.
Yeah, that was a point when we did the workshops live that we really reinforced, I think, was that a lot of services will ask this question, but then often it doesn't mean they're accessible.
No.
So I guess throughout your life experience, what would you say would be a negative or not useful example of a worker or someone in that sort of context asking you about your disability and probably not having like a negative reaction or it not being very kind? Does anything come to mind?
I think, again, it comes down to the use of language and how the terms they use. But I think also it's about having just an open conversation where you don't make judgments. So, if I was to, sometimes I get when I identify my actual diagnosis and say I'm a person with cerebral palsy, people think they're being well-meaning and they might say, oh, but you don't look like you have cerebral palsy. I met John the other day and, oh, my gosh, he has high level of spasticity or whatever, spasticity. And, you know, I think that's not really helpful. But yeah, it's just about, I guess, being mindful that you just respect the person's story and what they're telling you. And yeah, it's not a compliment necessarily to say I don't look like I have cerebral palsy.
Totally. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think a lot of times workers might feel uncomfortable after they ask that question about disclosing, so they feel a need to like follow up by making a comment like that, which actually just isn't useful.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And it can be a really nerve-wracking thing. I remember I was doing some work in the tertiary sector many, many years ago, and there was this thing of, well, a person shouldn't have to disclose their disability, you know, particularly if they felt it might affect their chances of getting into a university course or what have you. But it really is, like, from an inclusive point of view, it really is helpful, so that, like in my example of the tertiary sector, so that the university can actually go out of their way to make your life easier. But this was kind of in the 90s where that was seen as really important. But so yeah, I'm in two minds. Like, yeah, you shouldn't have to on the one hand, but where it's around making your life easier or making services more accessible, I think it's a good idea.
I remember in our focus groups, I'm not sure if it was yourself or someone else was saying, if you can talk about the reasons why you need to ask if a person has a disability, like the benefits.
Yes,
sort of like,
yes.
Do you think that's a good way to sort of set that question up? Like
I do.
Yeah.
And say that we want to be like a flexible, responsive service and make sure we're providing our service that best meets your needs, you know, and make people feel warm to it. I think that's probably a really good way to go.
Absolutely. And what would you say has been what's been a positive outcome of you disclosing your disability to a workplace or an organisation before? Have you been supported well?
It means that I've gotten the support I need, or that something's been made accessible to me. Like, for example, when I'm reading things in paper format, I prefer a 16 font because I also have issues, a bit of sight issues. So it just makes my experience, whatever it is, whether it's attending a conference or, you know, looking at accommodation needs, it just means that I get some services and supports that meet my needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And what do you think for workers, what do you think are some of the essential things, like at a bare minimum, they should understand when working with a woman with disabilities, when they're supporting a woman with disabilities?
I guess to know a bit about the disability but not get caught up in the disability, if you know what I mean. So a woman with disabilities needs to, for example, escape a domestically violent situation is almost identical to a woman without disabilities needs. She just may need extra support. But like her intention or need to access the service is just the same as every other woman. Like, I often find, for example, it's a bit different, but it's kind of the same. When I go to a doctor about something, they'll get all hung up about my disability diagnosis and try to link the reason I'm seeing them to my disability, which is, like, oftentimes irrelevant. I might be going for the common cold or whatever, and it has no bearing on my disability as such. But like, so in the context of domestic and family violence services, that woman's need to leave the violent relationship is just as essential as any other woman, possibly even more so, because she's probably more dependent on the perpetrator for her everyday supports. But yeah, I guess so. In the one hand, don't get too caught up in like, oh gosh, this woman's needs are going to be so complex, we're not going to be able to provide a service. But on the other, it is actually important to understand what her everyday needs are, so that you can actually have it, you know, have your best shot at making sure she has the support she needs.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of workers sometimes feel worried about these interactions working with women with disabilities because they haven't had much experience in the area, or are worried they're going to say the wrong thing. And often there's not many specialist disability services that support women with disabilities who are experiencing gendered violence. So often this is workers in like a mainstream service that haven't had any disability specific training. What would be your advice? Like, if at a bare minimum, what do you think is essential for a worker in those mainstream services to know when they're working with a woman with disabilities?
My understanding is that even like, it doesn't really matter what type of disability a woman has. They're very, like, they've lived with it. They've lived with it for a fair amount of time, and they're actually good at articulating what their needs are. So it won't be about the nerves. Won't necessarily be about getting the information. It'll be more about, like, is it okay to ask this? And I think it's really just about establishing that relationship with the woman as you're talking to her. So, you know, it's about saying, like, is it okay to ask questions about this? And almost like getting her consent, and then feeling, then once that consent has been gotten, feeling comfortable to ask questions. And you can always say, look, if there's any questions you don't feel comfortable about, or you feel that I've asked in the wrong way, you can always feel that you can correct me, and, you know, I won't take offence to that. This is about trying to offer you the best support we can. And then in terms of if she has like a paid network of support, I would say it would be around, again, seeking her permission, but like working, like if she's got NDIS supports and she plan manages, it'd be about getting her consent to perhaps have a chat with the plan manager about how we're going to provide supports in this situation. Like, for example, if she has to come into a shelter for a while, talking about how we can make that work. So there is a bit of, I guess, extra work involved, but you know, unless it's a situation where the woman's got absolutely no support and is reliant on the perpetrator of the violence, there should be other resources you can draw on. And speaking from personal experience, when I worked for an organisation that was helping people to access the NDIS, we found a woman who was working in a shelter, and this was the catalyst she needed to be able to fast track an NDIS application. So the NDIS stands for National Disability Insurance Scheme, and it's the nationwide scheme that provides disability support services to people with disability. And so this was the catalyst she needed to fast track an application to the NDIS, because previously her only support for her and her children were her was her abusive partner, and he helped her with one application previously, but kind of said in the application she didn't need anything because I provide everything. And so therefore the NDIS rejected the application. But like this was not only the catalyst for her to be able to move from a shelter, it also became the essential thing she needed to maintain custody of her children, which could have been difficult without any formal support.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that throughout this whole series, we'll talk in more detail about that sort of working with the NDIS and disability services alongside support for gendered violence, because it's important that a woman has access to both and they work together.
That's right. Right.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Karen. This has been a fantastic conversation, and we'll see you again in workshop 5.
Thank you. Bye.
Awesome. Bye.
Thank you everybody for watching our first workshop in the series, Foundational Knowledge. Hope you enjoyed my discussion with Karen, as well as some of the information we've started to discuss here. Now, this is our very base level information. I really encourage you now to have a look at your handout where there's links to additional training and more information to understand disability more specifically. And I now encourage you to continue on in the workshop series at your own pace. And next workshop, we're going to be looking more specifically at the experiences of gendered violence for women with disabilities. And I look forward to seeing you then.